Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this special On the Road podcast. The reason it's on the road is because I'm heading up to PorcFest. I'm giving a talk there, and in the state of New Hampshire, I'm driving along, beautiful mountains, trees, beautiful day, and had some hours to while away. So I said, well, why don't I go ahead and record a Rejoinder podcast to a podcast that was recently published by noted libertarians Bob Murphy and Adam Hamon. Now let me put things in context here for those of you that might not be aware of the full controversy here. So on the subject of immigration, the controversy begins with a recent debate in New York City at the Soho Forum by noted libertarian Dave Smith and equally noted libertarian Alex Nowasta on the subject of immigration. After that debate, Bob Murphy published a podcast on his Human Action podcast analyzing the debate. And then he followed that up with another podcast on his personal podcast with Adam Hamon, another noted libertarian, discussing again the debate. So after this, Richard Ebeling, another noted libertarian, and my colleague with the Libertarian Angle at the Future of Freedom Foundation, published a debate challenge to the Future of Freedom Foundation, challenging Dave Smith and Bob Murphy to debate two things. One, which is the genuine libertarian position under the libertarian philosophy? Government-controlled borders, and specifically the federal government control system that we have and lived under for many years, decades, or open borders. And then secondly, regardless of that issue, should America continue this federal immigration control system, or should we instead adopt a system of open borders? Okay, so it was a double challenge. Well, Dave responds immediately and says, no, I just debated Alex Nowasta, and so there's no need to have another debate anytime soon. And then Bob responded and said, well, I have differences with Dave's plan, and so I'm going to decline the debate too. So this motivated me to publish a podcast that analyzed the debate as well as analyzed these two podcasts by Bob Murphy solo and then Bob Murphy and Adam jointly. And then we followed that up with a joint podcast with Sheldon Richmond, me and Sheldon, analyzing the same things. And Sheldon, of course, is the former editor of the Freeman at the Foundation for Economic Education. He's now with the Libertarian Institute, longtime libertarian, strong advocate of open borders. Also, he's formerly associated with the Future of Freedom Foundation some years ago. So this motivated Bob and Adam to publish a new joint podcast that addressed in a critical way my solo podcast, analyzing the debate in their two podcasts. And they didn't address the Sheldon joint podcast, but that's okay. They spent their time, which was almost an hour and a half, criticizing or analyzing in a critical way, is a nicer way to put it, my solo podcast. So this Rejoinder is a response to their response, this new recent joint podcast of theirs. Now, I should point out at the offset that these guys were very complimentary. I mean, this is high-level discourse, okay? And Adam and I have been friends for many, many years. And I don't know Bob on a personal level, but I think he knows I have the utmost admiration for his scholarship and his work in libertarianism. In fact, Bob, you might be interested to know we have something in common. That you mentioned in your podcast that Richard Ebeling had been a professor of yours at Hillsdale College when he was Ludwig von Mises professor there. And this was before he became president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And of course, he's at the Citadel now. But even before all this, he was at the University of Dallas, where I was practicing law. And I hired Richard to give me a chapter-by-chapter tutorial, weekly tutorial, on Ludwig von Mises' magnum opus, Human Action. So that's what we have in common, that Richard has been our professor, both of us. So I really do appreciate the high-level discourse, even though we disagree. And I appreciate the nice compliments that y'all said about me and about the work of the Future of Freedom Foundation. It's quite an honor. Appreciate it. But I want you guys to know something. That if your objective was to butter me up so that I'd go easy on you in this rejoinder, it ain't going to work. Because I'm going to be real upfront with you here. I want to thank y'all for giving me this opportunity, because it's an opportunity to do something I've wanted to do for a long time in this area of immigration. I mean, I thought this controversy was over, and then you guys published this critical podcast, and I said, oh, they've now given me an opportunity to fulfill a long-time dream. And that dream consists of two things. One, to smash to smithereens this ridiculous, inane, jerry-rigged rationalization for libertarians to support immigration controls under the rationale that this is the genuine libertarian position instead of open borders. Okay, I'm going to smash that to smithereens. That's my objective. I'm going to bury it. It needs to be buried. It is so inane, and I'm going to bury it in libertarian cemetery. Now, of course, it could be revived later on as some kind of zombie apocalypse, but we won't worry about that. My objective is to bury it here in the short term. And then the second thing, to smash to smithereens this whole libertarian support of immigration controls in this massive socialist system and the massive police state that comes with it. So I appreciate the opportunity, and that's what my objective is going to be in this rejoinder. Now, let's begin this with an analysis of that debate. You've got Dave Smith's position over here, and y'all pointed out that you don't know exactly what Dave's position is, but I know that when Bob had Dave on his podcast, Dave made it pretty clear what his position is, not in terms of specificity, but if you look at the specifics of his plan and what he calls for, it's very clear what he stands for, and that is a sealed border. His vision is that immigrants are a negative on society. You can see this the way he responds to Alex Nawaste. Now, Alex will cite statistics showing that on net, immigrants are a benefit. For example, and there's nobody better than Alex Nawaste in terms of encyclopedic knowledge of statistics and data on immigration. This guy's phenomenal. And so Nawaste's position, for example, is that, okay, let's assume that 5%, I'm just making this up, but 5% of immigrants come and get on welfare. And he says that even given that, the 75% or the 95% that come here with vitality and energy and entrepreneurship and opening businesses and buying stuff at retail, that they generate so much economic prosperity that it far outweighs the 5%. He's got all the data to support this type of thing. Dave's position is the exact opposite. He says those studies are fallacious, they're false, and Dave's position is that immigrants are a net negative on American society, and they pollute American culture, and that he really wants to seal the border. Now, he doesn't put it like that, but if you look at his plan, which we'll examine as the podcast goes, this rejoinder goes on, you can see that is his position. But he supports the federal immigration control system that we have. Okay, and he essentially supports Donald Trump's war on immigrants. On illegal immigrants, too. You can tell that Trump's trying to get rid of a lot of legal immigrants, like Chinese students that are here on visas legally, or students that disagree with or are critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza, and he wants to get rid of them. And because Trump believes that immigrants in general, at least this is my opinion, are a negative, and that we don't need them. Okay, and we've got to keep in mind that sort of as a general overall viewpoint, that this federal immigration control system that Dave Smith supports, and a lot of other immigration control advocates support, is a socialist system. Now, why do I say that? Well, because it's based on the principle of central planning. This is not the free market deciding the movements of people in one of the most complex labor markets in history, and millions of people, countless people. It's the government planning this. And they're deciding in a top-down command and control fashion how many immigrants are going to be able to come in, how many from each country, what their credentials are, what their qualifications should be, with their educational levels, their monetary status, what their background is, or their gang members, and so forth. So the government's planning this, and that's what central planning is all about. Now, as Ludwig von Mises pointed out, central planning always results in what he called planned chaos. Now, what better term could you find to describe the situation on the border all of our lives? And I grew up on the border. I lived more than 30 years on the border. I know borderland culture, and I can tell you there is nothing but planned chaos. And everybody knows this. You got deaths of people dying in the backs of 18-wheelers, dying of drowning in the Rio Grande, dying of thirst in the desert, dying with a bullet hole in them put in by a border patrol or a National Guard, or, just massive chaos. Backlogs along the border, people, trying to come in under refugee status. You couldn't find a better term than chaos. Planned chaos. And that's what central planning does. It produces planned chaos. This is the system that Dave supports. Now, not only that, it produces a massive police state. And I've experienced this police state. I'm talking about highway, things you find in a totalitarian country. Highway checkpoints, roving border patrol checkpoints, where they stop anybody on the highway who haven't even gone to Mexico. Get out of your car, open your trunk, let's see your ID. If you're brown skin and you're in an old model car, you're under suspicion at these checkpoints. And then the roving border patrol, trespasses on the private ranches and farms without warrants. All this is done without warrants. And then you've got the criminalization of transporting, harboring, taking care of, giving water to, whatever, hiring illegal immigrants, boarding a Greyhound bus. It's a veritable police state down there. It consists of Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, Border Patrol, ICE. It's a veritable police state all along the border that comes with this immigration control system. And so, if we turn over to Alex's position, Alex favors what is called an Ellis Island kind of immigration control system. And this is modeled after the immigration control system in the late 1800s in the United States, which is still a government control system, okay? But it's a system where the government lets in most of the immigrants. There's no seal border here. I don't know what the percentage would be, but I think in the late 1800s, they were letting in 97%. So there's 3% they were excluding. And I don't know exactly what Alex's excluded areas are, but I think it's like people with tuberculosis or maybe some other communicable disease. I don't know, maybe measles or something like that. I'm not really sure. I think there's another category he has. I know in the 1800s they had tuberculosis and mentally deficient people. It was expanded to people who might be public charges, like welfare recipients. But that's like 3%. And Alex would let in the vast majority. I don't know what his percentage is, but let's say it's 95%. That's the Ellis Island system. But they're both government plans. You see, that's the important thing in here, is that we're dealing with what government plan should be adopted. Now, there's a lot of people in the libertarian movement have been taught that Alex's position is open borders. And so the word goes out, Dave won the debate. They defeated the open border position. And that's what passes for immigration debates in the libertarian movement now. A battle between which central plan is going to be better. And the central plan that is over here in the Ellis Island system is called open borders. But it's not open borders. It's a government control plan that's simply more benign, more expansive than this government control border over here. Now, in the middle, there's all kinds of central plans. You'll find that every libertarian advocate of immigration controls has a different plan. It's very rare where you find them both, two people, agreeing on the same plan. They're always on this spectrum of over here 95%, 70%, 40%, total sealed border, and they disagree. So when Bob said he disagreed with Dave's position, I naturally assumed that's what he meant. That this is that he disagreed with the specifics of the central plan. But this is totally different from open borders. Okay, this is why we challenge them to a debate. Let's have a real debate. So when Dave says, well, no, I already finished with debating Alex Nawaste, I don't need to debate again. That's not the kind of debate we want to have. Dave wants to debate another immigration control advocate and say, well, that's open borders. But it's not open borders. Okay? So that kind of outlines for you what the debate's about. Now, Adam in this joint podcast made a really interesting point. He says, well, Jacob's position really is a government plan. He's a central planner too, because under his system, the spigot's just opened all the way. So what he's referring to as spigot is the government's got the spigot, and it's either close the spigot, like over here, the extreme, seal the border, which is essentially what Trump wants to do with this massive police state. And at least that's my opinion of what he wants to do. And then you start opening the spigot, and you start letting in more and more and more until you get the Alex Nawaste's position, where he wants to let in 97%, let's say. And then so Adam is saying, well, Jacob wants the spigot all the way open, and so his is a central plan too. See, he doesn't understand the principle of freedom, economic liberty, the principle of freedom of movement. It has nothing to do with a spigot. We don't want a spigot. We reject a spigot. The spigot's owned by the government. We don't want the government to decide what churches we're going to go to on Sunday. We don't want the government to open up the spigot and say, oh, well, we're going to let y'all rest on Sunday. You don't have to go to church this Sunday, but next Sunday you got to go to church. No spigot with respect to churches. No spigot on what you get to read. And no spigot on freedom of movement. Now, interestingly enough, at the beginning of their podcast, Bob Murphy says that he was recently in Los Angeles, and he says that somebody interfered, and this is his phrase, with his freedom of movement. So, okay, he's talking about a fundamental right, freedom of movement. It's been long established as a fundamental, natural, God-given right. This is part of what Jefferson was talking about in the Declaration of Independence, that there are certain fundamental, inherent, God-given rights that pre-exist government, that government cannot legitimately interfere with. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, gun rights, and freedom of movement. The right to move. And in fact, Richard and I were just talking the other day about this great essay. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It was written by a man named Paul Perot, who was the longtime editor of the Freeman at the Foundation for Economic Education, where Richard ultimately served as president, where I served as program director for 2 years, where Sheldon served as editor for many years. Paul Perot wrote a brilliant little pamphlet called The Right to Move. Okay? And I'm sure you can find it online for free. Fantastic essay talking about this principle of freedom of movement that Bob mentioned as a fundamental right. And so when Adam was saying that Jacob's plan is a government plan, no, it's not. In fact, my ideal would be like freedom of religion and freedom of the press, where there's no spigot, or gun rights don't have a spigot either. Government's letting us own guns. That's not freedom. When you start talking about a spigot or a letting, you're not talking about freedom anymore. So my ideal, for example, would be a constitutional amendment that says neither the federal nor the state governments shall enact any law managing, controlling, regulating, or interfering with freedom of movement, including across international borders. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean trespass on the private property. It just means the right of people to move to other areas consensually. Okay? So, it's a principle of freedom, Adam. It's not a government permission system. There's no spigot. Now let me outline, let me define what I mean by open borders, just so everybody can understand what page we're on when Sheldon and I and Richard and other advocates of open borders, what we mean by this, because it's not the system of the Ellis Island government control system. Let me explain it. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people come from Maryland into Virginia. And the border between Maryland and Virginia is the Potomac River for much of the border. Just like the Rio Grande's, the border between Texas and the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, and the U.S. and Mexico as a country. Same principle. River is the border. And every day, hundreds of thousands of people come into Virginia. Now, these people include rapists, murderers, robbers, thieves, drug dealers, terrorists, Muslims. Let's see, what other dangerous, scary creatures we have? Did I mention terrorists? I think I did. Illegal immigrants. Okay, in other words, everybody is coming into Virginia every day, flooding hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, you know how you often hear that these Latin American countries are sending their worst people? President Trump often says that. They're sending us their worst people, and they're keeping their best. An argument can be said that Maryland's doing the same thing. They're sending us their worst people. And the same with the other states north of them, because they can come down into Maryland and then cross into Virginia. And so an argument can be made they're sending us their worst people and keeping their best. So there's no restrictions. There's no control. In fact, get this. Tonight, every single American, this is a possibility, could be packing their bags with the plans to drive to Maryland and come down into Virginia. All 350 million Americans. Imagine what this would do to our infrastructure. Now, if this doesn't frighten people in Virginia, I don't know what will. This is a distinct possibility. You can't deny it. Virginia's an attractive state. Well, how would we handle this with our infrastructure, the public school systems? And yet, here they are. That is open borders. That is open borders. That is the system we favor when we say we favor open borders. Not a spigot, not a government checkpoint at the bridge there, at the American Legion Bridge, that starts checking people coming across and vetting them and seeing which ones are members of gangs in Maryland and which ones are robbers and rapists, which ones have criminal records, which ones are terrorists, criminals, and none of that. There's no checking at all. Open borders. Okay, that's our system. Okay, so now we got our terms clarified on what we wanted to debate on. So when Dave says, well, I already debated Nawaste, fine, but that's not open borders, Dave. That's what's commonly called open borders in the libertarian movement, but it's not open borders. Okay, so let me return back to this podcast, that this joint podcast that I'm responding to in this Rejoinder, the Bob Murphy, Adam Hamon podcast. Okay, now I'm going to be upfront with you guys. I watched the whole program, and at the end of the program, I was totally befuddled because I didn't know what your positions were on immigration. Y'all spoke for almost an hour and a half criticizing my position on open borders, or at least seem that way. I mean, y'all were talking about, public schools and pedophilia and state museums and parks and libraries and needle users on the public sidewalks. But at the end of this thing, I'm thinking, what? Where do they stand on immigration? And I couldn't figure it out. And so I called a friend of mine, libertarian, old line libertarian, principal libertarian, open borders advocate. And I said, hey, do you watch this? He goes, yeah. And I said, can you tell me where they stand on immigration? Adam and Bob? He says, I'm confounded. I don't know. I'm thoroughly confused. I don't know what their position is. And so it was like, well, weird. Now, at the very end of the podcast, they read a text by another libertarian advocate of the federal immigration control system. And this is a guy named Steve Kinsella, who's been a long-time proponent of immigration controls. And he says, be sure you make this point about the public highways. And this is this Rube Goldberg jerry-rigged, weird rationalization that they've come up with to justify that the federal immigration control system is the genuine libertarian position instead of open borders. And he says, be sure, he emphasizes this point. And the light bulb goes off in Bob Murphy's head, and he says, why didn't we address this in the first 5 minutes? And I'm there, exactly. And not only just the first 5 minutes, but the whole rest of the program, instead of going off on public schools and pedophilia and heroin addicts and all this, museums and libraries and sidewalks, address that. And this is what I've noticed about advocates of this jerry-rigged system, is that I think they lack confidence because they know deep down it is so fallacious, it is so inane to justify this massive socialist system as part of the libertarian philosophy, that they look for ways to distract people with the pedophilia in the public schools and all this. And Dave did this in his debate with Alex Nawaste. Dave starts debating how state enterprises should be privatized. So the debate goes off in this whole direction of, well, should the state sell off their enterprises or should they give stock to the taxpayers? And I'm sitting there saying, what the heck does this have to do with immigration? But it was like this big distraction that takes it away from this inanity of, the government owns the highways, which we'll get to in a minute, and the bridges, and therefore the government should control the border. But we'll get to that later in this rejoinder. But I just wanted to mention that I don't know where you guys stand now. Adam, if I had to guess, based on reading between the lines, Adam leans toward Alex Nawaste's position, because it was kind of clear that he doesn't want a nasty, vicious border patrol. He wants a benign enforcement system here. In fact, I brought up this example of where you got two brothers on privately owned land, entirely private, in Arizona. There's no river now. It's just an imaginary line. You see, there's no border line like a red strip of tape that says border that stretches all the way across the southern border. You don't find that. There's nothing there. You don't know where the border is. It's imaginary. A surveyor can find it. So these two brothers, one's a Mexican citizen and one is an American citizen, which would not be too surprising along the border. All this was part of Mexico. And so the American brother invites the Mexican brother over for dinner. And the Mexican brother says, hey, I'll be there. And he gets on his horse. He starts to reach this imaginary line and immediately encounters a border patrol who has trespassed onto the American brother's land. They've gone from the highway, entered the ranch, and gone all the way past the brother's house down to the border, which is about 2 miles from the house. And as the Mexican brother's coming over, no. You don't have permission from the government. You didn't get permission from the government. I don't need permission from the government. This is private property. I'm going to my brother's for dinner. No. And they will stop him. And they will use force to stop him. Okay? And so Adam, in addressing this, says, golly, Jacob, I don't favor that. That's an invitation. That's private property. I don't want that pea green vehicle on that thing. But he doesn't understand that that's the immigration control system that he favors. You see, that the problem here is that every libertarian central planner's got a different plan. And so he's got this conception, well, under my plan, the government wouldn't be able to do that. But it's not his plan that is adopted. Once government is vested with the power to control who enters the United States, it's all along the border. And so the Border Patrol has that authority, and we're talking about the real world here. We're not talking about, some pie in the sky utopian, society. This is real world stuff, and I can tell you it's real world stuff because I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande. We irrigated out of the river, and that we'd go down to and the Border Patrol had the power to come into our farm anytime we wanted, without a warrant, without a search warrant, because they were controlling the border. They could go all the way to the river. Now, we hired illegal immigrants on our farm. They're hardest working people. They live there on our farm with us. My dad had a place for them to live. We weren't harming anybody. This was a purely consensual transaction. In fact, whenever they would bust our workers, which they would do periodically, my dad would sometimes go to the unemployment office and hire people on unemployment. They were the laziest people you'd ever find. My dad would immediately go out and hire illegal immigrants again, to bale hay. And I'd work out in the fields. My brother and I would work out in the fields with them, and we became friends with them. And when the Border Patrol could come under our farm without a warrant, Adam, without a warrant, that's the system that you favor. Okay? Now, it's not your central plan, but it comes as part of the system. And so the Border Patrol would bust our workers. Now, oftentimes they would hide. Interestingly enough, the Border Patrol would never search our home. We lived on the farm. We had our home there, and we had a barn next to our home. And they never searched the barn or the home, which I think they had the authority to do. But so the workers, when they'd see them coming in the gate, and if we had a lock on the gate and we hadn't given them a key, they would just shoot the lock off. They wouldn't call us and say, hey, you forgot to give us a key. They just shoot the lock off. All right, so they'd come into the farm. The workers would go into the barn and hide. Sometimes I'd run in there and hide with them. And but every once in a while they'd bust our workers. And that's what the authority is, to control the border, Adam. That's the way the system works. Regardless of good intentions. I know you have good intentions, and you say, well, I don't want that to work that way, Jacob, but that's the way it works. In fact, if we go over to Alex Nawaste's position, let's return there for a minute. Say, what's wrong with that system, Jacob? What's wrong with the Ellis Island system, where the government is controlling just the exclusion of certain groups, small number of groups, 97%? Well, if I have to choose between central plans, I'm clearly going to sympathize with Nawaste's position, okay? It's closer to the ideal. It's still a government control system, but I sympathize with that system. And it was a tremendous benefit in the late 1800s. Millions of immigrants, penniless, couldn't speak English, were flooding American shores. This is anathema for Dave Smith. This is what's called the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. This is the lower classes of society. These were not the rich people coming from Europe. This is the poorest of the poor. They couldn't even speak English, most of them. And you can see pictures of them. Go Google pictures of, or Wikipedia, pictures of immigrants in the late 1800s. You can see why they call them the wretched refuge of your teeming shores on Emma Lazarus' poem on the Statue of Liberty. This is what libertarian right-wing immigration control advocates, they don't want those kind of, I love those kind of people. They were the principal cause of the tremendous increase in prosperity in the so-called Gilded Age. It's the most prosperous period, and oh, by the way, the most charitable period too, in history up to that point. Real wages were doubling and doubling again in very short periods of time. Not despite these immigrants, but because of these immigrants. They were one of the factors. Now, there were other factors. No welfare state, no national security state, sound money, gold and silver coins were the official money, and on and on. No income tax, no IRS, no Federal Reserve. But immigrants, now, Dave would argue, no, those immigrants are a drag on society. He would say that America would have been much more prosperous without them. Bull. That division of labor and that vitality and those prosperity and those people wanting to become rich, and many of them did become rich. They were fleeing the lands of government security to come to a society where it was root, hog, or die. And they were a major factor in the increase of prosperity. So I clearly would sympathize with it. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that it never stays that way. And Bob can totally understand this point, which I'll explain in a minute, that whenever you're going to vest power in government, you've got to assume that your very worst enemy is going to wield that power and exercise the power. So, for example, if I came to you and said, look, we're going to have a government law and a government agency that's going to have the power, and we're going to put a libertarian in charge of it to censor any book advocating communism. You might say, oh, wow, that's fantastic. We get rid of all the communist books. Okay, now people are not going to be able to learn communism, because there's not going to be books to read. Well, no. For one thing, you can't go that route because it's just basic principle that people have a right to no matter how dangerous it is, to read the wrong books. Oftentimes they say, well, the libertarian control advocates on immigration say, we don't want to let immigrants in because they might bring socialism in. Well, it's the same with books, okay? Should we ban books being imported from socialist countries because they're teaching socialism? No, of course not. But the other principle is that the wrong people get vested with the power. When the communist is in charge now of this power of censorship, he can say, we're going to use this power to ban capitalist books. So you see, it gets dicey. So that's why you never want to vest power in somebody unless you can imagine and live with your worst enemy wielding that power. And so when they vest power to control these groups, inevitably, or to determine who the groups are going to be excluded, like tuberculosis and so forth, the groups inevitably expand because other people get into power. And so, for example, the group expanded to exclude prostitutes. Well, that's an interesting thing. How do they determine who the prostitute is, okay? And then, get this. The groups expanded to exclude anarchists, which is kind of funny because a lot of the libertarian advocates of immigration controls are anarchists. Now, what's an anarchist? An anarchist is a person that wants to abolish the Supreme Court, the Congress, the executive branch, the presidency, all the federal courts, wants to abolish government entirely. At all levels, the state governors, the legislature, the state courts, abolish them all. The city councils, everything. Total anarchy. That's what they favor, just total anarchy. All right? Well, the immigration control advocates under the Ellis Island system decided they were going to exclude anarchists because they're dangerous to society. So these same guys that favor the immigration control system would not have been permitted to come into the country as anarchists. It's kind of amusing. In fact, another amusing aspect of this, I'll digress for a second, but these anarchists who support this massive socialist immigration control system, and the massive immigration police state that comes with it, that now we can see requires the military, the national security state, which President Eisenhower said was a very grave threat to our democratic processes and our liberties. But they need the military, as we're seeing now, to seal the border, to win the war on immigrants. And so it's kind of interesting, humorous to see anarchists supporting this massive government apparatus. So anyway, I digress on that point. But what we're talking about here is expanding the groups. So as early as 1882, they expand the groups to exclude Chinese. This is horrific. I mean, any Chinese. The they'd let in Chinese men to build the transcontinental railroad, which was backbreaking work, very dangerous work. A lot of the Chinese immigrants lost their lives building this thing, across the mountains and so forth, and horrific work. But they completed it. They did it. But as soon as they finished, they go back to San Francisco and other parts of California, and immediately people, the bigots, wanted to get rid of them. Okay, this was their bigotry. They felt like the Chinese could never be real Americans because they felt they didn't look like real Americans. So they wanted these guys to go back home to China. Well, these guys didn't want to go back home. They wanted to stay here in America. And so they started to carve out lives for themselves, building a laundry and that sort of thing, and building Chinatown. But so they started putting these horrific restrictions on their ability to make a living, trying to starve them to death. So some of the cases went to the Supreme Court, and fascinating judicial decisions involving this horrible racist discrimination. But then they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I'd highly recommend go on YouTube and Google. Type in Chinese Exclusion Act. You'll see they're great documentaries on the horrific things that were going on. They banned all Chinese from coming in, all Chinese. And so here are these guys. They want to marry. Obviously, they're young men. They built this railroad. They want to have families like people want to do, and they can't find a wife. They want to marry Chinese, and so ordinarily the Chinese women would come over and they get married and start a family. But with the Chinese Exclusion Act, no women could come over. So these guys can't find anybody to marry. And so the idea was, well, you want to get married, you go back to China. And so guess what would happen? Well, this goes back to the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, a lot of Americans don't realize or don't really appreciate the magnitude of what happened in 1848. I mean, the magnitude is so humongous that people are still shocked today that 150 years later, there's still consequences of it. But the United States government essentially stole the entire northern half of Mexico. They provoked a war to steal the northern half that they had offered to buy, and Mexico said, no, our country's not for sale. Like Trump wanting to buy Greenland or what, Panama Canal or whatever. That's what they wanted to do with the entire northern half of Mexico. And Mexico said no, so they provoked a war, the U.S. did, and easily won the war. The United States is much more powerful than Mexico. And as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we get the entire northern half of Mexico. It's a huge upheaval in American culture. They talk about immigrants coming in from Latin America and changing American culture. Imagine absorbing the entire northern half of Mexico today. That's what they did. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, the parts of Colorado, Utah. Texas is a little bit special case because it had declared its secession and independence from the rest of Mexico, but Mexico had never honored it, never agreed to it. But in any event, you've got this absorption of a foreign country with everybody there. It was Mexican. They spoke Spanish, Mexican culture. People don't realize this. That this is a long-lasting upheaval, that it is still affecting America today. I once talked to a guy in Mexico who had been here as an illegal immigrant and returned to Mexico, and I said, what was it like coming into Texas and California? He had worked all along the border states, and he says, I felt like I was in Mexico. And fascinating, because it was part of Mexico. But Americans refuse to acknowledge that. It's just, oh, Jacob, speak English in America. Now, I should say, though, that during this 50-year period after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the border remained open between the United States and Mexico. Okay? I mean, it was natural. This had been Mexico, and now the United States controlled it. New border, for Mexico. It was now a new border for the United States. It's now a new border, imaginary line. But you can imagine the fluidity of movement. I mean, that it just remained normal. They might have had a checkpoint or something at the border, but everybody could just flow back and forth. For 50 years, this was open borders. And no, billions and billions didn't pour into the United States. I mean, I love it when I see libertarian immigration control advocates say, well, 1 billion people would come to America, because I always think of Carl Sagan, the astronomer, billions and billions of stars or something. And so billions and billions of immigrants did not flood into Texas or Arizona. It was just a fluidity of movement. People back and forth across the border, the same way like Virginia and Maryland. For 50 years, open borders. But what happened was the Chinese figured this out. Chinese women wanted to find guys to marry over here in America, wanted to move to America. They started going to Mexico and then crossing this fluid border. And U.S. officials figured that out, and the bigots figured it out. And so that's where they need the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol wasn't established till 1924. 1924, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was 1848. So that's a long time. That's, 60 years or something like that, 70 years with an open border there. But they now had to stop the Chinese from coming across the border. So the groups start to expand, is what I'm saying. And now, and then in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt administration used the immigration control system to expand it to a new group, Jews. And a lot of Americans don't realize this. This is America's contribution to the Holocaust. Hitler offered to let German Jews leave Germany in the 1930s. This is before the Holocaust. Holocaust doesn't get going until World War II. So Hitler says, I want to get rid of Jews here. He was treating them much like the Chinese were being treated in Chinatown, okay? Excluding Jews from the legal profession or the medical profession, not giving them licenses and so forth like that. But Roosevelt's response, which was the response of the rest of the world, anti-Semitism was afflicting everybody, not just Hitler. He says, oh, well, no, we have immigration controls, and we have a quota system, and we've already filled the quota for Germany. We cannot accept these Jews. And so they had to stay in Germany, and that's where they lost their lives to the Holocaust. Okay, because the groups were expanding. And by the time World War II came along, guess what they were using Ellis Island for? A detention center for Japanese Americans, okay, where they were jailing Japanese Americans for the duration of the war, Americans, in this Ellis Island facility. Now, the reason I say that Bob Murphy can relate to this is because he came to my defense, and I'm very honored and appreciative for that, Bob. That in the Libertarian Party, and in one of the debates there, I was asked about the COVID thing, and I said, look, it's a no-brainer for libertarians to oppose mandates and the lockdowns and so forth, totally illegitimate abuse of government power. But I said, we need to go more than this, than just oppose these lockdowns and mandates. We need to raise people's vision to a higher level, and that's to separate healthcare and state. Get government totally out of healthcare at all levels, but abolish the Department of Health and Human Services and the Institute for Diseases, whatever they call it. Get government out of healthcare. Well, the right wing went ballistic, just ballistic. They didn't want that at all. They wanted to get rid of Fauci, but replace him with an anti-vaxxer like Kennedy, which they've gotten now. This is their dream, to put an anti-vaxxer in charge of the power. And I'm saying that's no solution, because the next time around it's going to be a Democrat up there that's going to be turning things around. And they were also saying that anti-vax is the libertarian position. Totally misguided understanding of libertarianism. Libertarianism is not anti-vaccine any more than it's pro-vaccine. Libertarianism is pro-freedom. You want to take a vaccine, that's your right. You want to refuse to take a vaccine, that's your right. Okay? That's what a free society is. But they were saying, oh no, anybody that takes a vaccine is a dumb dolt of the state. This is what the right-winger libertarians were saying, which is not a very smart political move, because there are millions of Americans who took the vaccine, and they're not likely to vote for a party that's calling them dumb dolts of the state for taking the vaccine. But it's not the libertarian position. But they didn't want to separate healthcare in the state. They wanted government to have the power to send the physicians that prescribed vaccine to Guantanamo Bay. One right-winger That was his advocacy. He sent them there to be tortured and executed or detained forever in their lives, like they are at Guantanamo Bay. At the risk of belaboring the obvious, that is not libertarian. And so Bob came to my defense and said, Jacob's right. His position's absolutely right. But you see, I extend that to immigration, that the powers that is going to be abused, as we've seen. And that's what's wrong with the Noah State position. His heart's in the right place, no question about it, but it gets abused. Now, let me explain why Dave Smith's position is seal the borders. He doesn't put it like that, okay? And I'm reading between the lines, but here is his plan, his central plan. He wants an invitation system. He says that any person that comes to the United States should have to receive a formal written invitation from an American employer, or maybe just an American. I'm inviting you to come visit me, or inviting you for dinner, or inviting you to tour my facility here, or inviting you to work. So on first blush, you think, well, that's a rather benign system. In fact, somebody might think, wow, this is like the Bracetto program. That Dave's calling for the Bracetto program, the guest worker program in the 1950s that the federal government set up. I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but in principle, it worked like this. The government would, a farmer, let's say he needed 100 workers to harvest his crop, he would let the government know this, the federal government. The federal government would contact the Mexican government, and they would tell Mexican workers, hey, they need 100 workers. They'd all go sign up, and then they get transported somewhere or another, or maybe get there on their own, and show up at the guy's farm, and he'd check the list and make sure they were the ones that were been approved. And so I don't think I've got the exact mechanics down, but that in principle, it was a government program, okay? And so one might think, and it was fairly functional, at least the crops got harvested. So one might think, oh gosh, Dave's calling for the Bracetto program. Not so. Dave is calling for a formal written invitation system. Now let me compare this to the price system. I've already explained to you how an open border system works. In a free market system, which is really what open borders are, it's a free market system. The price system is the inviter. That's what makes the price system so intricate, so sophisticated as part of a free market system. The price system is the invitation. So a farmer in Oregon, he doesn't send out any invitations to get workers from Mexico. He just raises the price of labor to $50 an hour, let's say, plus transportation, room and board. And word spreads. And then there's a worker, let's say Juan Rodriguez in Oaxaca, Mexico, hears about this, immediately gets on the bus and heads to Oregon. That's an invitation. That's a price system invitation that works as part of the free market system. Or when a landlord advertises an apartment for rent, my apartment's rent for $1,000, that's an invitation. Now, oftentimes people will cross the country under our open border system and without any kind of invitation, but they know that invitations exist all across the country. Restaurants, are open. They're inviting people in without any formal invitation. But hey, here are our prices. Here's our menu. We're inviting you in. Okay? Motels, hotels. This is the intricacy of the price system in the free market system. This is not the system that needless to say, that Dave Smith favors for Mexican workers or Mexican tourists or visitors or whatever. They need to provide a formal invitation from some American, written. And almost inevitably, although he doesn't say this, it has to be notarized, because otherwise, Mexican immigrant, he can get a good printer and just make up a name. John Dokes from the United States has invited me, here's my invitation. So you got the whole problem with fraudulent invitation. So Dave's going to need a massive bureaucracy to examine these invitations to make sure they're authentic, and to contact the employer and the inviter and make sure he really did sign this and have it notarized. But here's the kicker on this. How does an American farmer know who to invite to harvest his crop? Dave knows this. It's an impossible task. Can't do it. I mean, like, what's he do? He looks in the internet and says, okay, let me see if I can find somebody. Oh, here's a Juan Rodriguez in Oaxaca, Mexico. Okay, well, but I see his name here, but he doesn't have an email address. Well, maybe because Juan Rodriguez doesn't have a computer. There's a lot of poverty down there. So, well, where I can get his address? Okay, well, maybe I'll contact the Mexican consulate and say, hey, can you get me the address for Mexican for Juan Rodriguez? So he sends it through the regular postal service, because the guy doesn't have email. So you've got to have the government postal service deliver this engraved invitation to Juan Rodriguez in Oaxaca. And so the guy gets it, he opens his mail and says, who the heck is this? Who is he inviting me? I'm very happy here in Oaxaca. Well, what? I'm not going to go up there. He's inviting me to harvest his crops. I don't care about his crops. So now the guy's got to start all over again and find, Manuel, Sanchez down in Cuernavaca or something. Totally impractical system. And Dave knows this, which means no immigrants come in with this system. Okay, which means a sealed border. That's, I can tell you, you read the lines that Dave's system is a sealed border system, but he crafts it with this engraved invitation system that sounds very benign. But it's more than that. Dave really makes it clear, man.
Object on road ahead.
He wraps it up where he says he's going to require a bond. That each inviter has to post a bond when he invites somebody up. Now, the bond is going to cover any potential expenses that are burdened on the taxpayer or citizenry that these immigrants might incur, like they go on welfare, or if they put their kids in public schools. I think Dave says that the average cost is $20,000 per student in public school, or if they go to the emergency room, or at some public hospital, or they drive drunk on a highway and run over somebody and don't have insurance, that the inviter has to post a bond to cover all this. Who's going to ever post such a bond? There's a woman that says, oh, I want to hire a nanny, an immigrant nanny to take care of my kids while I go to work. Well, ma'am, you're going to have to file $1 million bond to cover the potential expenses of these immigrants. $1 million? Oh, I don't have that kind of money. Well, you'll have to go get a surety bond. You have to find an insurance company. What insurance company is going to indemnify and signs a surety on this bond if she can't even cover it? And the American farmer who, let's say he wants to hire 100 workers, he's going to go file $100 million bonds, and if he can't find an insurance company to act as surety, he's got to go find friends to sign his guarantors, because he certainly is not going to accept a bond without co-signers, like a surety bond from an insurance company or a style of people. So now the government's in a whole new realm of trying to authenticate these bonds. Huge bureaucracy, which means nobody's going to do this. Nobody would be crazy. No farmer would ever file a bond. No woman wanting a nanny. Nobody's going to file a bond. And Dave knows this. So what looks like a very benign system is really a sealed border system. No immigrants at all. Because nobody's going to file this bond. Nobody's going to be able to find people to invite into the United States. Now, Dave understands this. And that's why I say that he's essentially on the same page as President Trump. Where Trump wants to essentially seal the border. I mean, and I've said this for 35 years at FFF that I founded in 1989. I've said anybody that thinks that police state along the border that I lived under for more than 30 years is going to be limited to the border, they're living in La La Land. Never is it going to be limited to the border. It's going to go nationwide at some point, and we're seeing that now. That the Berlin Wall wasn't enough. Remember they said all we got to do is build the Berlin Wall. Or all we got to do is criminalize the hiring of illegal immigrants, Jacob. If we pass that law, they can't get jobs. That'll be it. See, every central planner that comes up with a police state measure always thinks that that's going to be the clincher. But it never is. And so to win this war, and this is one of the benefits, and I put benefit in quotation mark, of Donald Trump, he's showing what is necessary to seal this border, including the destruction of due process of law, sending these immigrants to El Salvador in this terrorism confinement center, despite the fact they've never been convicted of a crime. They're now again indefinitely imprisoned and tortured in this terrorism confinement center, or evicting students because they had the audacity to criticize Israeli government conduct in Gaza. And if you think that freedom of speech can only be assaulted on immigrants and be protected still for Americans, not so. But Trump is proving that you need the troops too to get this thing done. Look at the troops in Los Angeles, okay? To put down protesters that are protesting these raids. And Trump can't understand, and the Libertarian Immigration Control cannot understand why Mexican-American families are sympathizing with these illegal immigrants, because this was part of Mexico that was stolen. This was their country that was stolen. And there's people here that say, well, Jacob, 150 years has passed. Enough's enough. You think 150 years is enough to undo the trauma of that unbelievable, phenomenal event? Let me tell you about my hometown of Laredo, because these immigration control advocates, one of the arguments they use is that these Latin American immigrants, or really immigrants in general, are polluting American culture. Well, for me, American culture is supposed to be a culture of liberty, and that means diverse cultures like Chinatown or Little Italy in New York, or the French Quarter in New Orleans, or it's different cultures, the Quakers, the Amish. I mean, these are all different cultures within America. That's what freedom is for me. But let me tell you about American culture in Laredo. Now, this is American culture. Now, I got a feeling this is not the culture that the libertarian and the MAGA people want to protect, but it's America. It's American culture. It's borderland culture. When I was practicing law in Laredo, like, the jury panels that would be coming into the state court, the judge would ask at the beginning of the jury voir dire, would everybody who cannot speak or write English please stand up? Easily 20 to 25% of the jury panel would stand up. Now, I know, the English only people, Jacob, this is outrageous, this is outrageous. Nobody cared in Laredo. Nobody batted an eye. The judge was very courteous and say, thank you for coming for your jury service. You can pick up your check, but you're excused. You can't serve on the jury. Okay. Nobody made a fuss about it. Nobody made a big deal. Nobody cared. Okay? And so I was down in Laredo several years ago, and I just did an informal survey in McDonald's, walking around from table to table, just curious. Easily 70% of the conversation was in Spanish. The conversations were in Spanish. If you go to a store like Walmart where they have a greeter, really fascinating. The greeter sizes up the person as they're approaching, and they'll say either buenos dias or good morning, depending on what they think the person is going to hear or wants to hear. And they're very good at it. The store signs are both in English and in Spanish. The street signs are named after Spanish and Mexican heroes, Iturbide, Zaragoza. Before we moved out to our farm, when I was a kid, we lived in town, and the street that bordered our house was called Malinche. Well, you know who Malinche was? She was the Aztec princess that betrayed the Aztecs and joined up with Moctezuma to defeat the Aztecs. Well, the street in Laredo is named after Malinche. This is culture. This is American culture. Now, I've got a feeling this is not the culture that they want to protect. But 97%, I think, when I was a kid, of Laredo was Mexican-American. In fact, I'll digress and tell you something else, because it's not really a digression, because, the immigration control advocates say, Jacob, if there was open borders, billions and billions. There you go with Carl Sagan again, the astronomer. Billions and billions of Mexicans would come into the United States. Well, Laredo is the only city in the United States that celebrates George Washington's birthday in a big way. I mean, everybody celebrates President's Day, but Laredo celebrates specifically George Washington and his birthday. big parade downtown with floats. On the floats are the debutantes of Laredo with their great big, beautiful, very expensive gowns. The parade is led by a high school girl riding a horse. She's Pocahontas. She's dressed as Pocahontas, and they've got a jalapeno festival, which I'm sure George Washington would have enjoyed, and the Noche Mexicana, and they have mariachis in the downtown plazas. Well, when I was a kid, and I think for about 10 years, not sure, but about 10 years, get this, Laredo would be open, the border would be open. Totally open to anybody in New Laredo. The Border Patrol would stand down, the Immigration Service would stand down, Customs would stand down. People could just cross the border freely and come and join the festivities. It was a wonderful time. People had a great time. You couldn't tell who was a Mexican citizen and who wasn't, and nobody cared. Okay, nobody cared. Everybody spoke Spanish. I mean, you'd go to the downtown plazas to listen to the mariachi bands in the plaza there, and everybody'd be walking around talking Spanish. You didn't know who was Mexican, who was American. Nobody cared. Okay, that's how open borders work, and that's how border culture works. That's why people in Los Angeles, that are mixing with illegal immigrants, it's all normal. This is what border culture is. It's seeped into Los Angeles, but it's all one country at one time, Mexico, and before that, the Spanish Empire. Well, while these 4 or 5 days were going on, the billions and billions of Mexicans did not flood into America. And into Laredo and then into America. In fact, the whole world could have come here. The whole world, billions and billions of people could have gone to Mexico and funneled into Laredo. Nobody did, okay? Because this is all this catastrophic type thinking that immigration control advocates, what if billions of people moved into Virginia, Jacob? Or millions of Americans, 350 million Americans were to go through Maryland and come into Virginia. Life doesn't work that way. You've got the price system. Okay, there was recently, in the last few years, several years, people were flooding out of California into Austin, Texas. Okay, and fleeing California and bringing in their socialist views. So, okay, and so they were flooding into Austin, much to the chagrin of people in Austin, to a certain extent. But it ultimately slowed up. Maybe it's even stopped now. Now, why? Because as more people flooded into Austin, the prices of housing started soaring.
There are police reported ahead.
And becoming very expensive. And so people said, no more. And so they would look for other places to go to from California if they still wanted to move. Same thing with Florida. Florida got really expensive. And so people said, hey, let's stop here in Georgia. That's how the price system works. And most people don't like to move. It's very traumatic to move. There's many Americans that don't even like to go to Europe on vacation unless they're with an American tour group or unless they're in a big city where they speak English. But to like go into Germany and rent a car and go into the small villages and stuff, because they don't speak English there. It's trying to go into a foreign country. Most people do not have that wanderlust DNA. And the people that do, they're like a gift to a society. They're the ones you want. They're self-selecting. But in any event,
there are police reported ahead.
These people would flood into Laredo, and some of them may have gone further north or whatever, but it was a very festive period. It's what the ideal is. Like the 60, 70 year period of American history where there was this fluidity after the U.S. ended up stealing the entire northern half of Mexico. Now, in Los Angeles, you still see, not surprisingly, 150 years after this robbery took place, where President Polk provoked a war to steal a country that Mexico had not wanted to sell. They refused to sell, so he provoked a war to force them to cede this territory to the United States, including California and Arizona, New Mexico, etc., that the ramifications are still there. Not only in terms of people in Los Angeles mixing together with, migrants from Mexico and come to their defense with protests and Mexican flags and stuff that seemingly make no sense. But when you study the history of how this whole thing happened, they start to make sense. And even President Trump has been adversely affected by this. How do I know this as 100% fact? Because he himself, his words, announced that he was going to send troops to Los Angeles. See a problem with that? With the sentence? Do you see a problem with the sentence? Think about it. He says, I'm going to send troops to Los Angeles. See the problem? He's speaking Spanish. I'm sure he's an English-only advocate. I'm confident he is. English only in America, Jacob. I don't care if this land was stolen from Mexico. It's been 150 years. But here's Trump is speaking Spanish. Doesn't even realize he's speaking Spanish. I bet most people don't realize they're speaking Spanish. But they are. They're mispronouncing the Spanish. I mean, the correct pronunciation is Los Angeles. That's the correct pronunciation, but it's Spanish. You can call it Los Angeles, and you can anglicize it. You can call El Paso instead of El Paso, but you're speaking Spanish. And so that's the impact of this system that we've had for at least 150 years here, that President Trump himself is speaking Spanish and doesn't even realize it. What he ought to say is, I'm sending troops to the Angels. Okay, why didn't he use that? Why didn't he speak English? It's because of this monumental upheaval of having stolen the northern half of a country that was steeped in the Spanish language. That was their language. Steeped in Spanish culture. Steeped in Spanish families and living in these areas. And overnight, saying this is now the United States. It will last for centuries. You cannot have a political upheaval like this without it affecting for centuries. Now, earlier I said that I didn't know where Bob Murphy's position was on immigration. But I've got an advantage, though, over Adam. This is going to shock Adam. Adam, you're going to be shocked over this one, I guarantee you. That when I challenged both Adam and Dave to a debate, I assumed they were on the same page. And I interpreted this from these two podcasts that had been done by Bob and Adam right after the debate. But Bob says, no, I have differences with Dave. And I just assumed, that he was on this spectrum of immigration control. He had a separate plan, like he was in the middle of the spectrum or something. Okay? Like I told you, every libertarian immigration control advocate has a different central plan. And so that's what I interpreted, but I obviously misinterpreted, because Bob sends me an email, and this was a shocker of an email. Because he says, I'm going to clarify to Richard too. He says, I'm going to clarify for y'all my immigration position. This is going to shock Adam Hamon, I guarantee it. Because it never came out in any of these podcasts. He says, I don't want the federal government involved in immigration. What? I mean, I was stunned. I mean, Bob, you spent the entire podcast, this podcast I'm responding to, it seemed to me, criticizing my position and seemingly building up this whole inane, ridiculous rationale for supporting the federal immigration control system, federal control of the highways. I mean, didn't you talk about the public schools and the pedophilia and the public libraries and the museums and the sidewalks? And wasn't that all about to bolster this inane, jerry-rigged system of making libertarians think that immigration controls, the federal immigration control, is libertarian? If not, what'd you bring that whole thing up for? I mean, look, I apologize to you, because I did misinterpret. When we challenged you to debate, I really thought you were on the same page as Dave Smith. And now I realize you're not. You're on the same page as Richard, me, and Sheldon. I mean, if I understand your position, when you're saying you don't want government involvement in immigration, the federal government involvement in immigration, you're open borders. You're just on the same page as we are. Which doesn't surprise me because your professor was Richard Ebeling, okay? He's a hardcore open borders guy. But I'm sure Adam's going to be shocked about this because throughout this podcast, you were saying, I agree with you, Adam. I agree with you, Adam. I agree. And when Adam would criticize Jacob and say, well, Jacob's position, he wants to spigot to open, there was many times where you would say, I agree with Adam. I agree with Adam. I agree with you, Adam. You never said, wait a minute, Adam. You're criticizing not just Jacob's position, you're criticizing my position too, because I don't want the federal government involved in immigration either. You never said that. Okay, now I'll go further. In the email, he said, Bob says, I want to clarify that I think this should be left to the states. Let each state decide this. So what he's really referring to is California, Arizona, Mexico, and Texas. But to a certain extent, all the states in the union, because you got airports in all the states. So all the states can establish whether they want to let in immigrants under his system. But what does he favor? What if a state says, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think we should do it? What is his position? He doesn't say, which I think is kind of a cop-out. Because if you've got, let's say, the drug war, I think it's a no-brainer to say, look, the government should not be involved in the drug war. The federal government or the state government. I don't think it's legitimate to say, well, I want to get the federal government out, but let the states decide. The states are, the drug war is oftentimes much more vicious than it is, okay, got a problem here. Okay, so this is a connecting video to the previous somewhat abrupt ending that you'll notice there where I said, I got a problem. You guys are going to get a kick out of this. I guarantee you're going to get a kick out of this. So I'm doing this podcast of all the ironies in life. And so I'm talking about Bob Murphy's immigration position. And I say, uh-oh, I got a problem. You notice that? Where the video comes to an end because I pressed the stop? You're never going to guess what the problem was. And it's the supreme irony of ironies. I'm daydreaming while I'm doing this podcast, and I miss the exit to go to Porkfest, and I'm just going up I-91, enjoying the sights, doing the podcast, and guess where I found myself? I found myself in Canada. I couldn't turn around. All these things says no turnaround, no turnaround, no turnaround. Here I am, going to this immigration control station, a border control station, the same kind of station that these libertarian, anarchist libertarians favor. I mean, is that ironic or what? And I'm sitting in this line for about 30 or 40 minutes, and I'm kind of freaking out, you see, because I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't have a passport. All I got is a driver's license, and I don't have those new, whatever they called, super security driver's licenses. And the worst of all, I got my princess with me. I mean, that's my dog Cassie, my golden retriever. She's my buddy. She's everything. She's my family. And I don't know what they're going to say about my dog. Are they going to confiscate my dog for unlawfully importing a dog into Canada? And so, but this is how immigration control, border controls work. So I finally, after about 40 minutes, I get up to the lady there, and I said, ma'am, I've screwed up. I really didn't mean to come into Canada, but I was daydreaming, and here I am. Let me see your ID, sir. So I give her my driver's license. So then she says, well, are you carrying any weapons? I said, no. And are you carrying any marijuana? No. And so she says, well, I'm going to have a colleague search your vehicle. See, okay? You see, they have a right to search my vehicle. This is what the system that these libertarian immigration controllers advocate. That when a person comes into a foreign country, they can search his vehicle, and they have the right. I said, okay. I mean, I know they have the right to search my vehicle under immigration control, border control law. It's ridiculous. There's no search warrant. There's no probable cause. There's no reasonable suspicion. They just have a right to violate people's privacy. So she says, well, it was a bluff. She says, on her part, she says, well, okay, I believe you. I'm going to let you go and turn around up there and go around. So thankfully, they left my dog alone. That's what I was really worried about. And so now I'm going back to the United States. I'm an American citizen. I've spent the grand total of about 30 to 40 minutes, half an hour, in Canada. Okay? I am now subject to a full search as an American citizen. This is their immigration control system that they favor. You know, they often think in terms of, oh, they're just violating the privacy rights of foreigners. Not so. When an American leaves the country, goes on vacation in Cancun, comes back to the United States, he is subject to a complete search. I was subject to a complete search, even though I only spent 30 minutes in Canada. Body cavity. You know, they don't need a search warrant. They don't need a reasonable suspicion, probable cause. They could search my entire vehicle if they wanted to. And then I was concerned also on the American side what they were going to do. There was a sign there, what they were going to do with my dog. There was a sign there that said, you have to declare all animals, you know, and fruits and vegetables and all this stuff. And I thought, oh, shoot. So I'm digging through her vaccination records thinking, well, maybe they're going to ask for the vaccination records. Now, they didn't search my vehicle when I finally got to the guy. I explained to the guy, I said, look, I screwed up. And so let me have your identification. They can make you show your papers. And he could have searched my vehicle, but he says, okay, go on. And he didn't ask for the vaccination records for the dog. I was concerned they might confiscate my buddy on this side. But this is their system. I mean, of all the ironies, I get subjected. It's been a long time since I've left the country. And, you know, I didn't carry a passport with me or anything. I mean, I'm going to New Hampshire and then Maine, you see. And, but there I am, subject to this system. So, sorry for the interruption, you know. But, so, I'm now heading back down the interstate here in the United States. And so let me just continue with Bob's position that I was talking about the drug war, that the drug war is very vicious. And I think it's incumbent on us libertarians when people ask us about the drug war that we want to end it at both the federal and the state level, because the state drug war is oftentimes much more vicious than the federal level. And of course, we all know that the drug war is very bigoted. It's probably the most bigoted government program since segregation, and especially at the state level. So we want to end it. We want to let people know that that's what libertarianism is about. The right to ingest whatever you want to ingest with no government interference. Well, it's the same with immigration controls. It's not enough to say, leave drug laws to the states. Okay? You want to make it clear that you oppose drug laws by the states, even if you favor this idea of the 10th Amendment. And the same with immigration controls. If you're going to leave it to the states, make it clear, I think they're illegitimate. They're an infringement. They destroy freedom of movement. But here's the thing. This is what happens when you compromise libertarian principles. You get into quicksand. And Bob, I think you're in intellectual quicksand here. And because I wrote him and I said, okay, suppose like Arizona decides it wants to open borders with Mexico. Okay, the other states, California, New Mexico, and Texas, close borders with Mexico. That means all the Mexicans can come, and all the Latin Americans who come into Mexico can now funnel into Arizona. Billions and billions coming into Arizona. Okay, so I said, can the other states establish border controls to protect themselves from all these immigrants that are flooding into Arizona? Because if they get into Arizona, they can go to the next state over, and then to the next state over. They can end up in New York City, okay, or Chicago. And so, does the state have the power? Well, that gets back to open borders domestically. And he didn't answer. How could he answer? How do you answer a question like that? Because if you don't, then you essentially have an open border system. If one state has an open border, the whole nation be. Because now the immigrant can go from Arizona into Texas. You know, just take the highway over to Texas or a bus or whatever. Even though Texas has control borders there at the U.S.-Mexico border. They come into Arizona and they head on over to Texas. Go through, New Mexico or Oklahoma or wherever. So inevitably you end up with 48 police states to prevent this from happening. So you got National Guard and police. You got the whole thing around every state border. You've destroyed America's open border system domestically. And so there's really just one solution to this, and that's just an open border system. And so let me get into that before we go into finish up this program with this jerry-rigged system where they claim that this whole thing is a libertarian position. I've said for 35 years here at FFF, there is only one solution to this immigration morass. There's none other. It's not the Ellis Island system for the reasons I've said. It's not a benign central plan. It's not comprehensive immigration reform. It's none of these things. The only solution to this planned chaos is to get rid of the cause of the problem. And that's the immigration control system. That's the root of the problem. That's the planned chaos. That's the deaths in the backs of the 18-wheelers. That's the highway checkpoints. That's the everything. The police state along the border. The deaths of people dying of thirst. It's that system that is the root cause. We see this in the drug war. Okay, we see violence in the drug war, cartels. What's the solution? You say, oh, Jacob, we got to crack down, like President Trump's saying, we got to crack down, we got to bomb the cartels. No, that's not going to do it. You destroy one cartel, you get 10 more to replace it. Okay? There's only one solution to getting rid of the drug war mayhem, the chaos. Legalize all drugs in the drug war. That's the cause of the chaos. Get rid of the cause of the chaos. It's like prohibition. How do you get rid of the Al Capones and the drug and the alcohol cartels and the violence and everything? Legalize alcohol. Okay? And it's the same with the immigration system. There's only one solution. Get rid of the cause of the problem. Get rid of the planned chaos. So you open the borders, get rid of the border patrol, the restrictions, have this fluidity of movement. I guarantee you did that today, there would be nobody talking about the immigration crisis tomorrow, because there would be no crisis. There'd be no more crisis. There'd just be this fluidity of movement between two nations, just like the fluidity of movement between Maryland and Virginia. Overnight, nobody would even be talking about the immigration crisis anymore. There wouldn't be a crisis because you've gotten rid of the cause of the crisis. So, and so not only is open borders consistent with liberty, freedom of movement, as Bob referred to it as, and which everybody recognizes as freedom of movement, but it's also, it works. It's the utilitarian case. This is a functional system. It harmonizes people's interests, and it protects liberty of contract and free markets and private property and freedom of association. Sometimes people say, oh, Jacob, do you put a sign on your door in your house that let immigrants come in? Well, that's a ridiculous analogy. That America is built on the concept of private property and freedom of association and liberty of contract. If I want to invite a Mexican into my house, that's my right. It's my house. You don't have to do it. But you don't have any right to establish a control that says, Jacob, you can't invite into your house an immigrant because we don't like immigrants and we don't want immigrants. You can't invite one into your house, or you can't hire him into your business, or you can't hire him on your farm. That's a destruction of liberty. It interferes with freedom. And let me address one more point about the libertarian non-aggression principle, because I got the feeling that Bob and Adam didn't really have a clear understanding of this principle, at least with respect to immigration. Okay, the libertarian non-aggression principle, which is the core principle of libertarianism, is that you cannot initiate force or fraud against another person. So that's how you determine whether a position is libertarian or not. Does it violate the libertarian non-aggression principle? Well, when you cross a political line, a border, you're not initiating force or fraud against anybody. You may do it after you've crossed the border. You may go murder somebody. But every day we cross political borders. When you cross a border into a new school district, you've crossed a border. You don't see the red line that says school district A versus school district B. It's just an imaginary line. A surveyor could find it, but you don't know where it is. But you haven't violated anybody's rights. When those people cross the border there from Maryland into Virginia, they have not violated anybody's rights. So if somebody stops them, like somebody interfered with Bob's freedom of movement, that's the person who's initiating force, because he's interfering with the exercise of a purely peaceful act of stepping across the border. Okay? That's purely peaceful. When I go from Virginia to North Carolina, the minute I cross that border, I have not violated anybody's rights. If somebody stops me there, like a government official, or like over here at this thing I had at the Canadian border, they have initiated force against me by forcing me to stop. That's how you know that the immigration control system is not libertarian. Automatically, under the non-aggression principle. Now, so you've got a system here today that is terribly destructive of liberty and very destructive of life. Death and suffering and abuse and humiliation and chaos and crisis on a perpetual basis. All my life I've seen this, all of our lives. And there's a solution out of it, and that's this open border free market system. Now let me address this inane, ridiculous, Rube Goldberg, jerry-rigged justification. Let me bury that in libertarian cemetery. Here's their argument that they've used for years. The federal government controls the highways and the bridges, therefore there's nothing anti-libertarian about the government exercising control over what it owns. Okay? Because with ownership comes control. Now we can say, well, the government shouldn't own the highways and the bridges and so forth, but the federal government owns these things, and therefore with ownership comes control. And that's where they move off into these weird areas of pedophilia and the bathrooms in the public schools and stuff like that. But the centerpiece of their argument is the roads, okay? That's what they've always used. Now let me tell you as a practical matter what happened here. All of these people came in from the Republican Party and from the conservative movement into the libertarian movement. They got dissatisfied with the Republicans and the conservatives, rightly so, out of control federal spending, debt. We're now at $37 trillion in debt, and it's climbing still. So they got disgusted. They said, we're going to join the libertarian movement. And they subscribed to many libertarian principles, but certainly not all. I mean, like school vouchers. I would say the predominant sentiment in the libertarian movement is pro-school vouchers. And I would say if you did a survey, most of them honestly believe that's a libertarian position. It isn't. Libertarianism is not pro-socialism. And vouchers are a socialist measure, taking money from one group of people to fund the education of another group of people to improve the socialist school system. But there's others. There's Social Security privatization, which is mirrors the system that the fascist dictator of Chile implemented, Augusto Pinochet. There's health savings accounts as a way to reform the Medicare and Medicaid system. There's supporting the national security state. Some people call for selective foreign interventionism. So it's like libertarianism is like watered down and attacked in all these things. And many years ago, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, where I worked for 2 years as program director, Leonard Reed. I once wrote an essay that the Freeman published when I was working there at FEE called "Leonard Reed Changed My Life." I mean, Leonard Reed was the biggest influence in my life, much more so even than Ludwig von Mises, who was like a close second place. But Leonard once wrote an essay. By the way, Richard was president of Richard Ebeling there at FEE, and Sheldon was senior editor of the Freeman there at FEE for many years. And Leonard wrote an essay once that called "Sinking in a Sea of Butts," where he said, we have people saying, I favor freedom, Leonard, but you've got to have school vouchers, but you've got to have public schooling. I mean, how would poor people get educated? And I favor freedom, but you've got to have Social Security for the elderly. People would be dying in the streets. And I favor freedom, but you've got to have immigration controls to control who comes into the United States. And I favor freedom, but. And by the time you add up all the buts, you're sinking in a sea of butts, like a quagmire of butts. and you've lost sight of what liberty's all about. You don't have a free society anymore because you got so many buts. And so it's important that there be maintained this pristine picture of what libertarianism is, and the libertarian brand. And this is why I founded the Future of Freedom Foundation. I felt that there needed to be an educational foundation that presented this pristine vision. And I remember, during our first year, Richard Ebeling, who was vice president of academic affairs for FFF at that time, and we were on the same page in just about everything. And he says to me, you do realize, right, that at the end of our first year, when we've made it clear where we stand on every issue, we will have alienated everybody. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. But we ended up attracting a loyal base of supporters that loved what we were doing, preserving this libertarian brand in a principled, uncompromising way. And many of them agreed with us. Open borders and abolish the whole IRS and income tax and the welfare state, and end foreign interventionism, entirely dismantle the national security state, restore sound money with a free market monetary system. And so they've kept us going for 35 years. It's really a marvel at it. I'm honored by it. But there's also been some of them that said, well, Jacob, I can't go with you all the way on this position, immigration or public schooling or whatever it happens to be. But I really admire you guys preserving the brand, and in the way you're doing that, I'm going to fund you. And so we've had this loyal base. Now, during that time, there's also been libertarians that says, we have no idea what you're doing. It makes no sense to us. We can't support you because, you're not supporting Republican candidates, and you're not, being practical. You're not supporting school vouchers, and you're just not part of the process here, and we can't support you because they have no conception. They can't see the importance of what we're doing. But the loyal base has stuck with us, and the new people that come in on board, okay, we're small, but our mission is to present this principle case. That's how we measure our success. Have we compromised any of these principles during the past year? And I'm fairly confident that we have never done it. If we did, it was very inadvertent over 35 years. And to a certain extent, Bob and Adam do not understand this concept of limited government. Bob says, oh, well, I guarantee you, Jacob, for limited government favors taxation. How does he reconcile that with the non-aggression principle? Bob, I would invite you to look at every single article I have ever written, every book I've written, every book I've co-edited, every podcast I've ever made, every conference I've ever spoken at. And if you can find one single reference to where I supported taxation, I will eat my copy of Ludwig von Mises' Human Action. I guarantee you will not find it. Okay? So I set forth my concept. Adams kept saying, oh, the whole solution here is anarchy. Jacob's just not an anarchist. He doesn't want to abolish the Supreme Court and the Congress and whatever. I set forth my position on why anarchy is not a viable paradigm in a 5-part series called Why I Favor Limited Government. It's on FFF.org. You can just Google it. It sets forth my entire understanding and belief in a limited government republic, okay, and why the anarchist system is not a viable system. I don't want to get into that. It's a whole entirely different debate. Okay, so back to this weird rationalization. They came into the libertarian movement. They couldn't leave the baggage behind in multiple areas, but in immigration, they realized that if they were going to be leaders in the libertarian movement, it wouldn't really do much to say, well, we disagree with libertarianism on this issue. I mean, that to me is a legitimate position. Hey, libertarians are right on education and welfare and foreign policy, and we just disagree with them on this, on immigration. I think that's very legitimate. But they didn't want to go there because they wanted to attack the libertarian position. They didn't just want to live with it. And to attack it is saying libertarianism is damaging to a society with respect to immigration, which is a major part of our philosophy. And so when you're attacking a philosophy that you're part of and saying that is damaging our country, that doesn't go over real well. So they had to figure out, they reached the conclusion that they wanted to stick with the Republican position, but they wanted to come up with a rationalization for it. So they did it backwards. They said, how can we figure out, this is my opinion, is that what happens, entirely an opinion, but this is the most logical thing they did. Let's go backwards and figure out if we can come up with a justification for this. So somebody like Dave Smith would go give a talk before let's say a Republican audience, hypothetically speaking. And he would say to them, I want you all to know that the immigration control system, the border control system that you all have brought into existence, and the massive police state, is really a libertarian position. You're holding the libertarian position. And if he were talking to a Democratic Party official or audience, he would say the same thing. I'll let y'all know that your immigration control system is the libertarian position. Libertarians just didn't realize this. Well, that's ridiculous. They would look at him and say, what? Are you nuts? Libertarians favor open borders. Genuine open borders, not the Biden type open borders where you've got a massive police state that isn't working. That's a system where people are circumventing the police state. Remember, open borders, genuine open borders, there are no restrictions at all. So, but that's the irony, is that he would sit there and tell Democrats and Republicans that their position that they've held for decades is the libertarian position. Ridiculous. All right, but what was this rationalization that they came up with? Here it is. That since the federal government owns the highways and the bridges, the international bridges, there's nothing wrong with the federal government discriminating against a class of people, i.e., immigrants, foreigners. And so, since libertarians believe in, ownership, private ownership, at least, that since the government owns the highways, that government gets to act like a private owner in deciding who's going to use the roads and highways, and therefore that's the way people come in, and therefore it's libertarian. Now, there's private discrimination rights, and we won't get into that, but libertarians believe in freedom of association. We're talking about government here. And in the real world, the government has carved out areas where the government cannot discriminate. And that's because society has put these limits on through the Constitution. That's the equal protection clause of the Constitution. That society, through the Constitution, which is a control on the government, has decided that we don't want government to treat people in a discriminating fashion. And so the areas that that society has set forth in this limited government paradigm that was set up when the government was founded, were no discrimination on the basis of race, color, creed, national origin. Later it was incorporated sexual orientation. So in other words, let's say that the government owns the highways. The government can't say no blacks can use this highway, which they might do. Like in the state of Mississippi in the 1950s, they set up a segregated system in the public schools, as I pointed out before, and Adam, and they were offended by this. That I would suggest that they would favor such a system. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when you have a system where government decides ownership is control, you want to have this overlay that says it's not a complete power they have. There's restrictions on that power. We don't want them to discriminate on the basis of race. And so you can't have a system where the government says, well, we built the highways, blacks can't use them except from 6 at night and 6 in the morning, then you can use the roads, but otherwise no. And Jews can't use them at all. Gays can't use the roads either. In other words, we don't want that kind of invidious discrimination. And society has spoken. And in a sense, it's somewhat arbitrary, because, how do you decide who government can discriminate against or not? We know that government can discriminate against people that are drunk on the highways. Okay, that's an arbitrary thing. Why can't a drunk driver drive down the highway? He's a taxpayer. He's paid for that highway. Well, I think all of us would say no. That's a rational discrimination. But what they want to do is use the federal control of highways and bridges. That's their rationale. Stephen Kinsella, the guy that I mentioned earlier that had sent in that text to Adam, he wrote an article many years ago, 25 years ago, saying, well, since the federal government owns the highways, which is the point that he was making with this text, the federal government, therefore, can control who comes into the country. Okay? That's the basic model here. With government comes control. And I would say the government should not be discriminating on the basis of race, color, creed, and national origin. And that's our system here in the United States. I mean, you go into the court system, they can't discriminate against foreigners in the court system. If a foreigner wants to file a lawsuit, he has that right. Or if he's prosecuted for a criminal offense, he gets all the same due process rights, right of trial by jury, right to counsel as an American citizen. I love that kind of system. Everybody's treated equally. That's the way it's supposed to be. All right, but that's their rationalization. Let's bury it now. Okay. Remember, here's the principle. Federal government controls the interstates, the highways, and the bridges that cross the border. Therefore, it's legitimate to control who comes into the United States. Problem one. The federal government, Steve, doesn't own the federal interstate highways. See, that's what they've always thought, that it's an interstate highway system, and therefore the federal government owns it. And the government doesn't even own the international bridges. In Laredo, IH-35 goes all the way to the bridge. And then you've got the international bridge. Guess who owns the interstate highway system in the United States? The states do. The federal government doesn't have anything to do with it. So if the federal government doesn't own the interstate highway system, how do they justify this jerry-rigged system that the federal government can establish this huge border control system? You see, they were always operating under a misguided conception that the federal government owned the interstate highway system. And, well, now I should say the federal government does own highways, but only in federal lands, like federal parks. Like if you drive in Yellowstone National Park and you're on the highway, you're gonna be traveling on a federally owned highway. But the interstates are not owned by the federal government. They're owned by the states. And guess who owns the bridge, the international bridge? Now, there was one international bridge when I was growing up, but there's like 6 now in Laredo because of all the commerce. And 4 of those bridges are owned by the city of Laredo, including the main bridge when I was growing up as a kid. The city of Laredo. So if the city of Laredo owns the bridge, how's that justify under this jerry-rigged system federal government control? See, it makes no sense. That's one big problem here with their jerry-rigged system. Okay? Problem 2. The federal government doesn't justify its control over who enters the United States on the basis of who owns the highways and the bridges. In South Texas, by the way, the international bridges are owned by the counties. Okay? So the federal government doesn't care who owns the roads and the bridges. The libertarians who have come up with this jerry-rigged system, they said, oh, well, no, see, this justifies the immigration control system. The federal government controls who comes into the United States independent of who owns the highways. That's not their rationale. I mean, even if all the highways were privatized, the federal government would still say, we control who comes into the United States. There's a total disconnect there, which shows you how inane this rationalization that they've been using, this jerry-rigged system to justify, oh, the federal government system of immigration controls and border controls is the libertarian position. Another problem, you've got private property, like in two bridges in Laredo are privately owned. They're railroad bridges, but they're privately owned. So under this jerry-rigged system, what do they say about that? Why can't people come over on a railroad on those private bridges? The federal government doesn't know those things, but the federal government won't allow that. They will not allow people to come across that railroad bridge without official permission. They control that private property bridge. Okay? So even if you had private highways and private bridges, the federal government would still say, we control. And so this example of the two brothers, remember that I mentioned in Arizona with adjoining ranches, where Adam said, God, I don't approve of that. He's just inviting them over for dinner. I don't want that pea green vehicle on there. That is their system. It doesn't matter that it's private property. It doesn't matter that the federal government doesn't own any highways into those ranches. They control the border. So you see, it's totally two separate and distinct aspects that they've conflated, these libertarians, as a way to figure out how can we make this the libertarian position. And so what's really happening here is a reality check is what these libertarians have been doing for 25, 30 years. If they've convinced ever-growing number of libertarians, young libertarians, that are entering the movement that this is the genuine libertarian position, massive federal immigration controls, this socialist system, is what they really have been doing is advocating a new police state measure. This is their new police state measure. Now, over the decades, you've seen police state measures on top of police state measures. When I was a kid, it wasn't illegal to hire an illegal immigrant. But somebody came up with a bright idea because immigrants kept coming in. They were circumventing the immigration control system like they did during the Biden administration. To a certain extent, Biden was deporting, large numbers of people too. Obama was the deporter-in-chief. That's what they called him. But you've got people circumventing this system, for ages. And that's just part of the system, the circumvention of this system. So people are coming in, so they mount up these police state measures. So they made it illegal to hire illegal immigrants. And their argument was, well, Jacob, if they can't get jobs, they ain't coming. And that was going to be the surefire fix. No more immigrants because there's no more jobs. Well, you can see, that was a big winner, wasn't it? And the same thing with the wall, the Berlin Wall. Remember? Oh, we just got to build the Berlin Wall. Okay, we're going to use eminent domain stealing of people's property, build a wall, but that's okay because this is it. This is finally it. Well, it isn't finally it. I mean, that's why you got the raids in Los Angeles and the troops being sent out, and the police state is now expanding nationwide. And it's what I've always said. They may succeed in sealing the border like North Korea did, but look at the North Korean society. That's what ends up happening. You end up destroying due process of law, freedom of speech, freedom of association. You end up with a police state nationwide to seal that border. That's the price you pay. And so this measure of the state making it illegal for immigrants to use the highways of America, presumably federal highways, but I think they would also make it illegal to use state highways, is just another police state measure that they think will finally work. That if immigrants can't use the highways, or that'll keep them from coming, well, that's ridiculous. They're going to come anyway. Okay, they've circumvented all these other police state measures, but notice what happens. You put this kind of system into place, and now you've got checkpoints all over the United States. Okay, where they're going to stop the brown-skinned people. Check your papers to see if you're violating this law. If you're a foreigner using the highways, it's just another police state measure, like on top of all the others. But it'll expand nationwide, I guarantee you, because the immigrants make their way up to Chicago and around the United States, North Carolina or whatever. Man, you got to start having those checkpoints to see who's got the proper papers. So that's all they're doing. That they've used it as a rationale, this jerry-rigged system, but really what they want is this newfangled police state measure. That ain't going to work anyway. It's part of what will become a very tyrannical society. Now, Bob mentioned, people can come into the United States. Jacob, there's no problem. People come to our libertarian conferences and from overseas, and they don't have any problem. What's the problem, Jacob? Well, there is a problem. They have to ask for permission. Okay? They've got to ask for permission. If they don't get that visa, that's what the visa is. Sir, can I come to your country to attend a conference? That's not freedom. When you're having to ask for permission, that is not freedom. And so, if they deny you the freedom, you don't come in. And what's also ironic here is that one of their arguments on this highway thing is that foreigners don't pay for the highways. The highways were built by taxpayer money, American taxpayer money. And so foreigners shouldn't be able to use the highways because they didn't pay for the highway. Well, these foreigners that come in to attend these conferences that Bob was talking about, they didn't pay for the highways either. He doesn't seem to have a problem with that, And but some of you know Roger Ver. He's a Bitcoin Jesus guy, big promoter of Bitcoin, multimillionaire. He gave up his American citizenship, and because he got disgusted with the trend of the United States, which a lot of us are disgusted with. But he gave up his citizenship. I don't know what foreign country he became a citizen of, but soon after that, he got invited to speak at a conference in the United States, and so he applied for a visa, no problem. Former American citizen. They said no. They said, you gave up your citizenship, tough luck, buddy. You don't come back. You see, that's the permission system. And sometimes they say no. And so my objective was to put this inane, ridiculous police state measure to rest as a justification. And I hope I've done that. Yes, put it to rest. It deserves to be buried forever. It's a ridiculous, inane system to say that this massive socialist immigration control system is libertarian, along with a massive police state that requires the military to win, and destruction of due process of law, and habeas corpus, and that this is and freedom of speech. You got those students that are criticizing the Israeli government's conduct in Gaza, and they're getting evicted now for that. This is not libertarian. And so hopefully I put this thing into libertarian cemetery. So there we are, okay? And as I said, for 35 years, there's only one solution to this immigration morass. There's none other. I repeat it, only one solution. And that's the solution we have domestically. It's the same solution we had for some 50 years on the U.S.-Mexico border. The free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. Immediately, the violence, the chaos, the death, the suffering disappears. It is the only solution. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your attention. Most of all, thank you for your great support of our work at FFF.